The grandfather clock in Michael's foyer chimed 11 times, and I watched my son stand up from the dinner table with that same practiced smile he'd worn every night for the past 3 months. 3 months since Margaret passed. 3 months since I'd sold our house in Calgary and moved into what my son called his forever home here in suburban Toronto. Time for Sarah's evening medication, Michael announced, reaching for the locked metal case he kept on top of the refrigerator. My daughter-in-law looked up from her untouched dessert, and I caught something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. Not gratitude, not even resignation, something closer to dread. "I can take it myself tonight," Sarah said quietly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "You don't have to." "Nonsense." Michael's voice was warm, almost playful, but his hand was already on her shoulder, firm enough that I saw her wince. "You know what the doctor said. Someone needs to monitor your dosage. Can't be too careful with these medications." He looked at me with that same easy smile. "Right, Dad? You understand. These opioid prescriptions are serious business." I nodded, because what else could I do? My son was a successful pharmaceutical sales representative. He'd spent years educating doctors about proper medication management. Of course, he knew what he was doing. But as I watched them disappear upstairs, I couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face. The way her hands had trembled when she stood. The way she'd barely eaten dinner for the third night in a row. The way my 10-year-old granddaughter Emma had stopped talking during meals, her eyes fixed on her plate like she was trying to make herself invisible. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief does strange things to the mind. Margaret had been my compass for 43 years, and without her, I felt unmoored. Maybe I was reading darkness into ordinary family life, because my own life felt so dark. That night, I lay in the guest room that had become my room, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Michael and Sarah's bedroom was directly above mine, and through the heating vents, I could hear Michael's voice, low and patient, explaining something. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone reminded me of someone talking to a child, or a pet. 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Michael's footsteps, heading back down to his office. I checked my watch. 11:23 p.m. Like clockwork. I'd noticed the pattern weeks ago but hadn't thought much of it. Michael often worked late. He had quarterly sales targets to meet, important clients in different time zones. But something about tonight made me restless. At midnight, I got up to use the bathroom. The house was dark except for a strip of light under Michael's office door. As I passed it on my way back to my room, I heard something that stopped me cold. Michael's voice, sharp and angry in a way I'd never heard before. "I don't care what you think you saw. You're confused. The medication makes you confused, remember? That's why you need me to manage it." A pause. Then Michael again. "Sarah, we've been through this. Your mother's money was supposed to be for our future, for the kids' education. I'm investing it wisely. You agreed to let me handle the finances when you got sick." My daughter-in-law's voice, so faint I almost missed it. "But the statements don't." "Don't what? Don't make sense to you?" "Sarah, you can barely remember what day it is. Yesterday you couldn't find your own car keys. They were in your purse the whole time." I stood frozen in the hallway, my engineer's mind automatically noting details. The condescension in Michael's voice. The way he interrupted her. The way he reminded her of her own supposed confusion. This wasn't a conversation. It was something else entirely. I crept back to my room, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with my age. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to make sense of what I'd heard. Sarah had chronic back pain from a car accident 5 years ago. I knew that. She took prescription pain medication. Michael managed it for her because, as he'd explained to me, she sometimes got confused about dosages. He was protecting her. He was being a good husband. Wasn't he? I thought about Sarah at dinner. The way she'd seemed almost surprised when I'd asked her about her garden, as if no one had asked her about anything in a long time. The way she'd started to answer, then glanced at Michael and trailed off. "I don't really garden anymore," she'd said. "I'm not up for it these days." But I'd seen her garden from my bedroom window, overgrown, neglected, the roses that were clearly her pride and joy gone wild. And I remembered Margaret telling me years ago, before the accident, how Sarah had won a local horticultural society award. "That girl has magic hands with plants," Margaret had said. "They bloom for her like they're showing off." I didn't sleep much that night. And the next morning, I started paying closer attention. It started small. Observation was what I'd done for 40 years as an engineer. Identify the problem, gather data, look for patterns. The pattern was there, once I knew to look for it. Every morning, Michael prepared Sarah's breakfast. "Her medication needs to be taken with food," he'd explain cheerfully. He'd hand her 2 pills from the locked case, watch her swallow them, then take the glass away. Sarah would pick at her food, then excuse herself to lie down. "The medication makes her tired," Michael would tell me. "Doctor's orders to rest." By the time she came back downstairs around noon, she'd seem foggy, disconnected. She'd start to say something, then forget what she was saying mid-sentence. Michael would jump in, finish her thoughts for her, explain what she meant. "Sarah has good days and bad days," he'd tell me sympathetically. "We just have to be patient with her." But here's what I noticed. On the mornings when Michael had early meetings and I'd made breakfast, Sarah was different, sharper. She'd laughed at something Emma said. She'd asked me about my career, remembered details from conversations we'd had days before. "I'm sorry I've been so out of it lately," she'd told me. "I think I need to talk to my doctor about adjusting my medication. But Michael says I'm fine, that I just need to give it more time." I'd nodded, smiled, poured her more coffee, and made a note in the small journal I'd started keeping in my pocket. The notebook was Margaret's idea, in a way. She'd always kept journals, pages full of observations about life, about people, about the small details that told larger stories. "The truth is in the details, Norman," she used to say. "You just have to pay attention." So I paid attention. I noticed that the locked medication case was always on top of the refrigerator, always within Michael's sightline. I noticed that Sarah never had her own key to it. I noticed that Michael measured out each dose himself, never letting Sarah see the bottles. I noticed that Sarah's mother had passed away 8 months ago, leaving her a substantial inheritance. Michael had mentioned it once, casually. Sarah's mom was smart with money, he'd said. Left everything in a trust for Sarah and the kids. Sarah made me the trustee to manage it, since she's not in a condition to deal with financial matters right now. I noticed that Sarah had mentioned wanting to visit her mother's grave in Ottawa, but never seemed to go. "Maybe next month," she'd say vaguely, "when I'm feeling better." I noticed that Emma had stopped inviting friends over. That 12-year-old Jake spent most of his time in his room with headphones on. That both kids seemed to walk on eggshells around their father, always careful, always watching. And I noticed that every single night, at 11 p.m., like clockwork, Michael would take Sarah upstairs for her evening medication. And 20 minutes later, he'd be back in his office with the door closed, and I'd hear the sounds of him working. On a Thursday afternoon in my 4th month living there, while Michael was at a conference and Sarah was resting upstairs, I found myself standing in front of that locked metal case on the refrigerator. I'm not proud of what I did next. I'm a man who believes in privacy, in trust, in respecting boundaries. But I'm also a man who spent 4 decades solving problems, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong. I pulled a chair over and took down the case. It was locked with a simple combination lock, the kind you'd use on a gym locker. I tried Sarah's birthday. Nothing. The kids' birthdays. Nothing. Then, almost as an afterthought, I tried Michael's birthday. The lock clicked open. Inside were 3 prescription bottles, all in Sarah's name. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of the labels, then opened my browser and searched for the medications. The first was oxycodone, a standard pain medication. The prescription was for 2 10 milligrams tablets every 8 hours. But when I counted the pills, the math didn't add up. There should have been far fewer pills if Sarah was taking the prescribed dose. The second bottle was diazepam, a sedative. I frowned. I didn't remember anyone mentioning that Sarah was taking a sedative. The prescription was dated 3 months ago, right around when I'd moved in. The dosage: 1 5 milligrams tablet, as needed for anxiety. The third bottle made my blood run cold. Quetiapine, an antipsychotic. I searched for it on my phone, and the more I read, the more my hands shook. This medication was typically prescribed for schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression. The side effects included confusion, memory problems, difficulty concentrating. Sarah didn't have any of those conditions. At least, she hadn't 4 months ago when I'd last seen her at Margaret's funeral, when she'd been sharp and present and supportive. I took photos of everything, carefully putting the bottles back exactly as I'd found them. Then I locked the case and put it back on the refrigerator, my mind racing. Either Michael was properly administering medications prescribed by a doctor, in which case Sarah's condition had deteriorated dramatically in the past few months, or my son was deliberately drugging his wife. The thought was so monstrous, I almost couldn't hold it in my head, but I forced myself to think it through like an engineer. What would be the motive? Control? Sarah's inheritance? Both? I needed more information. That evening at dinner, I casually mentioned that I'd run into an old colleague who was dealing with chronic pain. His doctor has him on some heavy-duty medications, I said. OxyContin, I think he said. Oxycodone, Michael corrected automatically. Similar, but different. We handle the oxycodone line at my company. It's a good medication when properly managed. He smiled at Sarah. Right, honey? Sarah nodded vaguely, pushing food around her plate. Do you like your doctor, Sarah? I asked. The one prescribing your medication? She looked up, seeming surprised I'd asked her directly. I haven't actually seen Dr. Patterson in a while. Michael handles my refills. He knows more about the medications than I do anyway. Makes sense, Michael said smoothly. No point dragging Sarah to appointments when I can just call in the prescriptions. We've known Dr. Patterson for years. He trusts my judgment. I nodded and changed the subject. But later that night, I looked up Dr. Patterson online. His practice was listed, along with a note that he'd retired 6 months ago and his practice had been taken over by a Dr. Jennifer Walsh. So who was actually prescribing Sarah's medications? At 11 p.m. that night, I heard Michael and Sarah go upstairs. At 11:20, I heard Michael come back down to his office. I waited until 11:45, when I knew he'd be absorbed in whatever he was doing, then quietly climbed the stairs. Sarah's bedroom door was slightly ajar. I knocked softly. Sarah? It's Norman. Can I talk to you for a minute? There was a long pause, then a weak, come in. I found my daughter-in-law lying on top of the covers, still fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. The bedside lamp cast everything in a sickly yellow light. How are you feeling? I asked gently, pulling a chair close to the bed. Tired, she whispered. I'm always so tired. And confused. I forget things, important things. Sometimes I can't remember whole conversations. Michael says I'm getting worse. Her eyes filled with tears. What if I'm getting worse? Sarah, I said carefully. Do you remember what medications you're taking? She blinked slowly. The pain pills. For my back. And something for anxiety? Michael says I've been anxious. She tried to sit up, struggled, gave up. I don't remember being anxious before. But he's right. I must be. Why else would I need the medication? When's the last time you saw your doctor? She pressed her fingers to her temples. I don't remember. A few months? Michael said Dr. Patterson retired. He was going to set me up with a new doctor, but then he said we didn't need to rush. He could manage my refills. He's an expert. He works for a pharmaceutical company. Do you ever feel like you don't need the medication? I asked. Like you feel better without it? Something flickered across her face. Recognition. Fear. Sometimes in the mornings, before Michael gives me my pills, I feel clearer, like there's a fog lifting. But then I take the medication and... She trailed off, her eyes going distant. Michael says that's just the pain breaking through, that I need the medication. He's probably right. He usually is. The way she said it, automatic and hollow, made my skin crawl. It was like listening to someone repeat a script they'd been made to memorize. Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Do you trust me? She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. Yes, she whispered. You're the only person who treats me like I'm still here. Like I still matter. You do matter. And I took a breath. choosing my words carefully. I think something isn't right with your medications. I think you might not need all of them. Her eyes widened. But Michael said, I know what Michael said. But Sarah, I looked at your prescription bottles today. I'm worried that you're being given medications you don't need. Medications that are making you confused on purpose. On purpose? She struggled to sit up again. And this time I helped her. Why would anyone do that? I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to believe it myself. But Margaret's voice was in my head. The truth is in the details, Norman. Your mother's inheritance, I said quietly. Michael mentioned he's managing it as trustee. Do you remember agreeing to that? She pressed her hands to her face. Bits and pieces. He said I wasn't capable of managing money in my condition, that I needed him to handle it. He had papers. I signed them, but I don't remember. She looked up at me, terror in her eyes. I don't remember what they said. What if I signed away? We heard footsteps on the stairs. Michael, coming up. Don't tell him we talked, I said urgently, standing. Act like you're sleeping. I need time to figure this out. Can you do that? She nodded, quickly lying back down and closing her eyes. I slipped out of the room just as Michael appeared at the top of the stairs. Dad, everything okay? Fine, I said, keeping my voice casual. Heard a noise. Thought I'd check on Sarah. She's sleeping. Michael looked past me into the bedroom, then back at me. For just a second, I saw something in his face that wasn't my son. Something cold and calculating. She needs her rest, he said. The medication helps her sleep. Doctor's orders. Of course, I said, and headed back to my room, feeling his eyes on my back the whole way. I lay awake most of that night, my mind working through the problem like I used to work through engineering challenges. Identify the issue, gather evidence, develop a solution. The issue. Michael was systematically drugging and manipulating Sarah, likely to maintain control of her inheritance and keep her compliant. The evidence. So far, just photos of pill bottles and my own observations. Not enough. The solution? I needed proof, hard proof, and I needed to do it without Michael knowing I was onto him. The next morning, I called my own doctor back in Calgary, Dr. Huang. We'd golfed together for years. I trusted him. Norman, good to hear from you, he said warmly. How's Toronto treating you? It's fine. Listen, James, I need to ask you something in confidence. It's about my daughter-in-law. I explained the situation as clinically as I could, reading him the medication names and dosages from my photos. There was a long silence on the other end. Norman, Dr. Huang said finally, his voice serious. If what you're describing is accurate, this is medical abuse. That combination of medications, particularly the quetiapine, would absolutely cause the symptoms you're describing. Confusion, memory loss, sedation, and if she's not actually presenting symptoms of psychosis, there's no legitimate reason for her to be on an antipsychotic. Could someone order those prescriptions without actually seeing the patient? It would be unethical. But if someone in the pharmaceutical industry had connections, relationships with doctors, it's possible. I've heard of it happening. He paused. Norman, this is serious. If your son is doing this, it's not just abuse, it's potentially criminal. You need to involve authorities. I need proof first, I said. Real proof. Otherwise, it's just an old man's suspicions against his successful son. Be careful, Dr. Huang warned. People who do things like this don't react well to being exposed. I thanked him and hung up, then sat in my room, thinking, I needed irrefutable evidence. I needed to catch Michael in the act. That's when I remembered my old nanny cam. Margaret and I had used it years ago when we'd had concerns about a babysitter. It was a small device that looked like a phone charger, with a hidden camera and audio recorder. I'd packed it when I'd moved, more out of habit than any real purpose. Now I had a purpose. The next day, while Michael was at work and Sarah was resting, I carefully set up the camera in Sarah and Michael's bedroom, angled to capture the area around the bed where Michael gave Sarah her medication. I disguised it as a phone charger plugged in near their dresser. That evening at 11 p.m., I watched my son take Sarah upstairs with that same practiced smile. And 20 minutes later, I went to my room and pulled up the camera feed on my laptop. What I saw made me want to weep. Michael stood over Sarah with the pill bottles. But he wasn't just dispensing medication. He was coaching her. His voice low and patient. "You're getting more confused, aren't you, honey? Having trouble remembering things?" Sarah, already groggy, nodded. "That's because your condition is worsening. It's not the medication. It's your illness. The medication is what's keeping you functional at all. Without it, you'd be completely lost. You understand that, right?" Another nod. "Good girl. Now, your mother's money. I've been investing it wisely, like we agreed, but you keep questioning me about it. That's the confusion. Talking. You signed the papers. You gave me control because you trust me. Remember?" "I trust you," Sarah mumbled. "Say it again. I trust you. And you need me to manage your medication because you can't do it yourself." "I can't do it myself." Michael smiled, that same warm smile he showed the rest of the world, and handed her 3 pills. Not 2, 3. "Take these. They'll help you sleep. Tomorrow will be better." I watched her swallow the pills. Watched Michael wait until she'd settled into the fog, her eyes going distant and glassy. Watched him kiss her forehead and whisper, "I love you, honey. I'm taking such good care of you." Then he left, closing the door behind him, and went down to his office. I sat in my room, trembling with rage and grief. That was my son, who I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd helped with his homework, who I'd been so proud of when he'd graduated university. My son, who was systematically destroying his wife's mind to maintain control and access to her money. Lord help me. I wanted to march into his office and confront him. I wanted to call the police right then. But Dr. Huang's words echoed in my mind. "You need proof, real proof." The video was a start, but I needed more. I needed to know what was happening with Sarah's inheritance. I needed to understand the full scope of what Michael was doing. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a spy in my own son's house. I documented everything. The times Michael gave Sarah her medication, the way he reminded her of her illness, the way he isolated her from friends and family, telling people that she wasn't up for visitors, the way he'd accidentally changed the subject when Emma or Jake tried to talk to their mother about something important. I also started searching Michael's office when he was out. I'm not proud of it, but I had to know. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Buried in his filing cabinet, I found copies of the trust documents from Sarah's mother's estate. Sarah had signed them 3 months ago, when she was already deep into the medication fog. The signature looked shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the confident script I remembered from birthday cards and thank you notes years ago. Michael had been named sole trustee with complete discretion over disbursements. No oversight, no accountability. I also found bank statements showing withdrawals. 50,000 here, 30,000 there. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. In total, over $200,000 had been moved from the trust in just 4 months. And I found something else, prescription pads, blank ones, with Dr. Patterson's old practice information pre-printed on them. Michael was writing his own prescriptions for Sarah. I took photos of everything, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady my phone against the desk. Then I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it. That night, I called an old friend from my engineering days, David Chen, who'd become a lawyer specializing in elder abuse and financial exploitation. I explained everything. "Norman, this is serious," David said. "What you're describing is criminal, fraud, forgery, potentially poisoning or assault with the medication issue. But here's the problem. Sarah is the victim, but if she's as compromised as you say, she may not be able to testify effectively or even understand what's happening to her. So what do I do? First, get Sarah away from him, safely. Then we get her to a doctor who can document her condition and run toxicology tests. With that, plus your evidence, we can build a case. But Norman, this won't be easy. Michael will lawyer up immediately. He'll claim he was acting in her best interest, that he had medical guidance. It'll be his word against yours. And Sarah's, I said. When she's clear-headed again, she'll remember. She'll be able to testify. Maybe. If the medications haven't done permanent damage, these drugs, especially in combination, they can cause lasting cognitive issues. I felt sick. How do I get her out safely? That's the tricky part. If Michael suspects, he might panic, might hurt her, or destroy evidence. You need to be smart about this. We talked for another hour, David walking me through the legal process, what evidence would be most useful, how to document everything properly. By the time we hung up, I had a plan. The next morning, Michael mentioned he had a 3-day conference in Montreal. I hate to leave Sarah, he said, but it's required for work. Dad, would you mind keeping an eye on things while I'm gone? Of course, I said, seeing my opportunity. I'll take good care of everyone. The morning after Michael left, I waited until 7 a.m., then went to Sarah's room. She was awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Good morning, Sarah. How do you feel? Tired? Foggy? Michael left my morning medication on the nightstand, but she trailed off. I don't want to take it. Is that crazy? I don't want to take my medication. It's not crazy, I said gently. Sarah, I need you to trust me. I don't think you need those medications. I think they're making you sick. I know this is hard to believe, but Michael hasn't been helping you. He's been hurting you. She stared at me, and I saw something wake up behind her eyes, something that had been sleeping under the fog. I knew, she whispered. Part of me knew, but I couldn't. I couldn't hold the thought long enough. It would slip away. And he'd tell me I was confused, and I'd believe him because I was confused. You're not crazy. You're being drugged, and we're going to fix this. But I need you to do something hard. I need you to not take any medication that Michael prescribed. Can you do that? She looked at the pills on the nightstand, then picked them up and walked to the bathroom. I heard the toilet flush. When she came back, her hands were shaking, but her eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in months. What happens now? Now we wait. It'll take a few days for the medications to leave your system. You might feel worse before you feel better. Withdrawal from some of these drugs can be rough, but I'll be here. And then, when you're clear-headed, we're going to get help. Over the next 72 hours, I watched my daughter-in-law come back to life. It wasn't easy. She had headaches, nausea, anxiety. But with each day, she became more present, more herself. On the second day, she asked to see the medication bottles. I showed her everything I documented, the photos, the prescriptions, the video of Michael coaching her. She watched it all, tears streaming down her face. How long? She asked. How long has he been doing this? I think it started around the time your mother died. Maybe before. The timing matches when the quetiapine prescription started. My mother, her voice broke. She left me that money for the kids, for their education, for our future, and she couldn't finish. We're going to get it back, I promised. But first, we need to get you and the kids somewhere safe. On the third day, when Sarah was clear-headed enough to understand everything, we made our move. David had connected me with a domestic violence organization that specialized in financial and medical abuse. They arranged for us to meet with a family lawyer and with police detectives who handled fraud cases. Sarah called her sister in Vancouver, someone she hadn't been allowed to talk to in months. Within hours, her sister had booked flights for Sarah and the kids. They would stay with her while everything was sorted out. What about Michael? Sarah asked. He'll come back tomorrow. He'll know I'm gone. Let him come back, I said. We'll be ready. That evening, Sarah sat down with Emma and Jake and explained what was happening. Not all of it, they didn't need to know all the dark details, but enough. That their father had been making their mother sick on purpose. That they were going to stay with their aunt for a while. That Grandpa Norman was going to make sure everything would be okay. Emma cried. Jake got angry, then quiet. But they packed their bags. I drove them to the airport the next morning. Before Sarah went through security, she hugged me hard. Thank you, she whispered. You saved my life. Literally. You saved yourself, I told her. I just gave you the space to do it. When I got back to the house, I called David. They're safe. Now what? Now we call the police. 2 detectives arrived that afternoon. I showed them everything. The videos, the forged prescriptions, the financial documents, the medication bottles. Doctor. Huang had faxed over his medical opinion. David had prepared a legal brief. The detectives took notes, asked questions, photographed evidence. "This is solid," one of them said. "We'll need Mrs. Callahan to give a formal statement when she's able. And we'll need to verify the prescriptions with the pharmacy. But, Mr. Callahan, what you've documented here, this is enough for a warrant." Michael came home that evening to find me sitting in the living room with two police detectives. I'll never forget the expression on his face. Confusion, then recognition, then calculation. His mind working through scenarios, looking for an exit. "Dad? What's going on?" "Michael Callahan," one of the detectives said, standing. "We have a warrant for your arrest for fraud, forgery, and assault. You have the right to remain silent." I didn't stay to watch them put the handcuffs on my son. I couldn't. I went to my room and called Sarah to tell her it was done. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and cried for the first time since Margaret's funeral. I cried for Sarah, for what she'd endured. I cried for Emma and Jake, who'd have to grow up knowing what their father had done. I cried for the son I thought I had, and for the monster he'd actually become. And I cried for Margaret, wishing she was there to help me make sense of it all. The legal process took months. Michael hired an expensive lawyer who tried every angle, claimed he'd been acting in Sarah's best interest, that he'd had medical guidance, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged prescriptions, the financial fraud, the video of him systematically gaslighting his wife while she was incapacitated. Sarah's toxicology report showed high levels of medications that were never prescribed by a legitimate doctor. A psychiatric evaluation confirmed she'd been given antipsychotics without any medical justification. The pharmacist testified that Michael had been filling prescriptions with Dr. Patterson's old prescription pads months after the doctor had retired. Michael was convicted of fraud, forgery, assault, and financial exploitation. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. The trust money was frozen and eventually recovered. He lost his job, his professional license, his house. He lost everything. And I lost a son. Not to prison, really. I'd lost him long before that, the moment he'd decided that controlling his wife was more important than loving her. I just hadn't known it yet. Sarah and the kids stayed in Vancouver. She's been in therapy, dealing with the trauma of what happened. The doctors say she'll make a full recovery, though some of her memories from those months will always be foggy. Emma and Jake are doing better, adjusting to life without their father. It's hard, but they're resilient. I'm back in my own place now, a small condo in Toronto. Not the house Margaret and I built together. I couldn't go back to that. But somewhere new, where I can start over. I think about that night often. The night I heard Michael talking to Sarah through the vent. What if I'd gone back to sleep? What if I'd convinced myself I was imagining things? What if I'd stayed silent out of loyalty to my son? Sarah would still be trapped in that fog. Michael would still be stealing from her. The kids would still be living in that house of lies. When I share this story with other seniors at my building, I see the same shock I felt that first night. How could a son do that to his wife? They ask. How could anyone be so cruel? I don't have good answers. All I know is that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who do the most damage. And sometimes the hardest thing we can do is admit that we were wrong about someone we love. But I also know this. Staying silent is complicity. Even when it's your own child. Even when speaking up means destroying your family. Because sometimes families need to be destroyed to save the people in them. Sarah calls me every Sunday now. We talk about everything and nothing. She tells me about her new job, about Emma's soccer games, about Jake learning to play guitar. She's rebuilding her life, piece by piece. And every time we talk, she thanks me for not looking away, for not staying silent, for choosing her over my son. You gave me my life back, she told me last week. I think about Margaret, about her journals, about her insistence on paying attention to details. I think about the grandfather clock chiming 11 that first night, and how I almost didn't notice the pattern. The truth was in the details all along. I just had to be willing to see it, even when seeing it meant accepting something I never wanted to believe about my own son. If you're reading this, and something feels wrong in your life, or someone you love's life, pay attention to that feeling. Look at the details. Ask questions. Don't let anyone tell you you're imagining things or being paranoid or causing problems. Because sometimes the people who tell you everything is fine are the ones who most need everything to stay exactly as it is. And sometimes the only way to save someone is to break the silence. God gave us instincts for a reason. Margaret knew that. I'm learning it, and if I can learn it at 67, maybe there's hope for all of us.